Yeah, thanks for having me again. It's a real pleasure to be part of the festival. And as everyone else has said, yeah, there's something special about Punta Araya. I don't know any other festival that has such a strong sense of community to it, and it feels like everyone's really encouraged to like connect. Often it's quite hard when you make abstract work. It's not always easy to sort of find platforms to show like the right context to show the works in, especially when you make. I mean, Jai and me make work that is sort of sometimes gallery based or installation based, as well as sort of standard film format based. Yeah, there's quite a lot to say about the project, and it's no longer my recent work because it was actually 2019 that we made this. Um, but I guess the best place to start is, I mean, it's called Escape Velocity 4, and it's part of a series of works that Jai is making called Escape Velocity. And it's the fourth kind of, what would you say? Yeah, the fourth installment of that project that is an ongoing number of works that he's making that generally involve him. A lot of it comes from field recordings based in Singapore, where he records kind of nature sounds, and he processes those sounds or sometimes presents them as they are. He also creates drawings that are somehow visualizations of those sounds. And there's kind of how to describe it. There's kind of an irony to doing field recordings of nature in Singapore, because there really isn't much nature left in Singapore, and what's there is constantly being eroded. And specifically for Escape Velocity 4, he recorded sounds in what is, I think, an area of Singapore's like oldest remaining jungle spaces, that has been there since before the British colonists began concreting everything, and starting a process that's still going on today of kind of urbanization of that landscape. And that space in particular is a beautiful area of jungle that you can go and kind of escape the city. But the plan is to sort of build. It's quite strange. They're sort of going to cut down some of the trees and build like a nature center, so people can go along and engage with nature once it's been built over and somehow, like, how would you say, like gentrified and formalized. But what's there now is already nature that you can go to. So there's kind of a strange process of, I guess, for Jai in some way, like preserving, through audio recordings, kind of preserving what's there. He invited me to Singapore, so I went to Singapore and I was there for over a month, working with him in the studio that he's based. And he took me on a little tour of the places that he'd done the field recordings. So I got to sort of see those spaces and see how they were, or how beautiful they still are in their kind of raw form, but also some of the areas that are being eroded. And I got to experience Singapore as well. And then he'd done a number of field recordings, and maybe he'd sort of selected, I guess, a number of different sections that he felt represented the spaces where he did the recordings. And what appears in the film is 6 separate sections that kind of blend into each other, that are basically untreated. The audio is kind of untreated, apart from being slowed down by 1 octave. Don't ask me the technical sound interpretation or description of that, but I think slowed down 50%, which his intention there is to kind of allow the human ear a bit more time to tune in to the diversity and the sort of intricacy of the bird sounds and the insect sounds. And then we sort of treated that as like a musical score. It was very much driven by him. It was quite a funny process because I traveled to Singapore. We discussed the idea, and I wanted to like animate and fill up everything. And his intention that I had to sort of tune into was to keep things very minimal and sort of let the sound drive the piece, and then pick out certain gestures and certain sort of audio actions that we wanted to highlight or play with. And we spent like 1 or 2 weeks before we really started formalizing what the film was and how long it would be and what the structure was, we spent 1 or 2 weeks just playing with different sound gestures and messing around with like some hand-drawn animation and some computer-generated imagery that was all coming from Jai's drawings. But we sort of sat together and collaborated on that, and gradually sort of built, I guess, what we would say is maybe a kind of a visual music piece. But the music is sort of coming from that story I told you about his recordings. It really was quite challenging for me as an animator not to fill up the space. He definitely had me on a bit of a lead, I think, like sort of not. And yeah, at the end, I was totally on board with it. I could sort of get it as we built the whole thing and watched it. You know, we sort of had individual sequences that we then stitched together. I totally understood it, and it was really fascinating. I mean, as I said, it was completed probably over 2 years ago. To watch it in the program today, with all the other films, it seemed to make even more sense to have that space. And I think what was interesting seeing it today was actually that it's quite a bit longer than a lot of the films in the program, at over 7 minutes. But it's really nice to be able to play with time in that sense, to allow space in between the visuals, and then the visuals almost have more strength, and that contributes to this idea of trying to tune in to the sounds a bit more strongly. I have a sort of what would you call it, a drawing tablet monitor, so I can draw directly into Photoshop or Toon Boom, and I can have the sort of audio file there, so I can sort of follow and time gestures with that. So it's sort of drawn in computer, if that makes sense. And then I also I mainly work with sort of After Effects tools in After Effects, and some 3D elements that, I mean, generally there's sort of a randomness to how all that, you know, we were sort of playing around with what visuals we could create that would fit specific sounds, and playing with how things are timed a bit as well, like particularly the sort of end sequence where you see the sort of the big blob like expanding with the sound, is like trying to offset the time sometimes, so it's not completely in time, but maybe there's I guess that a lot of that comes from Jai's drawings, that we then reinterpreted in sort of animation software, I suppose, is the best way to describe it. Jai has one of these parabolic microphones, which is it's a microphone that has almost like a satellite dish around it, and he spends a lot of time in the nature spaces that still exist in Singapore, and I think with that microphone he's able to kind of almost focus, so he can hear a sound and he can move the microphone in the right direction until there's like a perfect point where all the other sounds are sort of not being received by the microphone, but that one bird or insect is kind of tuned in. So there's kind of, I think that really helps to create an intimacy in the sound, that is, I mean, it's really beautiful to work with as an animator, because a lot of the power is already there, and it's just emphasizing and embellishing that, to create a finished piece. Thank you so much. I'm really inspired now to make more, so that I can be at the next
You have
Puntua Raya,
you
and
have
hopefully actually be there in person.